Okay, good evening, everybody. We're continuing with Mesilas Yesharim, the path of the just, finding your path. Last week we ended up with a contradiction between two ideas in Chazal. One is this idea of precious, of separation. Point of fact, it's last week's Parsha, Kadoshim Tiyu. Chazal Darshan, Chazal learn out from that, Prushim to you, that you should separate yourself. Distance yourself, even those things which are mutter, which are permissible, you should come back within your boundary and make those things for yourself personally osa, forbidden. And so that's one idea, the common idea of prushim. And there's another idea that it says that a person, it says in Koheles, in his Ecclesiastes, Solomon says, Shlomo Melech, Al tieh tzaddik harbe. Don't be too big a tzaddik. Another Chazal we saw is actually Yerushalmi and Nedarim. Lo daecha ma she'osra haTorah she'ata bo le'eso alecha devarim acherim. It's not sufficient that the Torah already made things osa for you, that you want to come now, you want to go and start making other things also on yourself, those things that the Torah didn't prohibit. So what we're going to do tonight to start off with is to try and resolve this contradiction between these two ideas in Chazal, in our rabbis, the spiritual masters, who taught us on the one hand that we should restrict ourselves even in those things which are mutter, on the other hand that a person should not be overly, strict. And there's another Chazal which I can't see here, which in the world to come, the Kodesh Baruch Hu will have a taina, will have a claim against anybody, against somebody who had the opportunity to take pleasure in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world and didn't do that. That'll be held up against him as a black mark, as something that he should have experienced, whatever that thing was. I think the story goes, I'm not sure it's completely accurate, but Rav Kook Zatzal, somebody said to him that he wanted to see the Alps because he didn't want to get to the next world, and the Kodesh Baruch would say to him, "What do you think of my Alps?" And he won't be able to say, "Amazing." So anything that a person theoretically, on one side, which is mutter, which is available, and he doesn't partake of it, there will be a claim against him. Okay, so now there are going to basically be two kinds of preshut, two kinds of separation, which is desirable, and one which is foolish. The idea, first of all, is that a person has to understand that everything in this world is a trial, is a challenge. The Mesilas Yesharim says right at the beginning of the book that a person was only created for three things: to la'asos es mitzvahs, to do the mitzvahs; la'avodas Hashem, to serve Hashem, which in the days of the Beis HaMikdash meant korbanot, and now we don't have through ba'amonotenu harabim, through our many sins, the Beit HaMikdash anymore. That's now taken by the place of tefillah, davening. And la'amod b'nesoyonot, and to stand up to tests. Everything in this world is a test. Mesilas Yesharim says at the beginning of the book, ponim va'acher, a person is surrounded in front of him and behind him in a raging battle. Over there, he says the challenge of poverty on the one hand, that a person doesn't steal because he doesn't have the wherewithal to support his family, when it becomes maybe very difficult for him not to put his hand and steal. On the other hand, somebody who has everything, it's easy for that person to come to the point of thinking, I did it myself, I'm a self-made man, and who's Hashem, God forbid. So these two challenges, those are the two challenges the Mesilas Yesharim speaks out at the beginning of the book. references those two, but really everything, a person should understand everything that he goes through in his life is a challenge. Specifically, I just interestingly, enough for myself, dealt with this idea in a video that I did for Vayamoyin. Vayamoyin is an amazing idea, which was to put out a short 2-minute video every day to help people in the challenge of, arguably the challenge of our generation, which is looking where you shouldn't look. Everything about the secular world says, look here, and most of what it's asking you to look at is indecent in one way or another. It's a well-known idea in advertising that if you want to sell anything, you will have a much better chance of selling it if you put a lady who's not particularly well covered. That's well known that's something which motivates certainly men to a great extent. So Vayamon has this institute. So I did this organization that puts out videos every day. It's amazing, except for Shabbos, obviously. Every day. It's been a couple of years now. So I did a video for them recently about this idea, coming back to this idea of everything is a challenge. I don't know if you know this, in the 1970s, the PL, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, an Arab terrorist group, hijacked 3 planes, and they forced the pilots to land in Jordan. And on one of those planes, they separated all the Jews, there are about 30 Jews, and all the rest of the other passengers they let go. And they held these Jews for 30 days at gunpoint. And they were finally rescued, Baruch Hashem. Now, amongst those passengers was a Rebbetzin called Rebbetzin Raful Harari, or Harari Raful, I forget which way around it is. And she was like a tower of strength. She kept her cool, and she was a source of inspiration and strength for everybody else. And she was asked afterwards, how was it that she was able to keep her cool keep so calm in the face of, nobody knew what was going to happen. At any second, they could have been machine gunned. She said, whenever I felt panic rising up in my throat, panic starting to take me over, I asked one of the terrorists for a glass of water. And when he gave me the water, I said, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shehakol nihiyeh b'dvaro, with a lot of kavanah, as much kavanah as I could muster. And I said, shehakol nihiyeh, everything is through Hashem's word. Right now, the situation I am in is through Hashem's word, b'dvaro. This is Hashem's word. This is where I'm supposed to be. And that gave me tremendous, calm in the midst of this challenge. But everything in the world is a challenge. Everything is the world. Everything that a person goes through in his life is a challenge. If somebody insults you, the challenge is not to reply to that. You feel tired in the morning, the challenge is not to go to daven. Something inappropriate comes on the screen, the challenge is not to look at it. Something comes up with a question or heksha, and you're hungry, the challenge is not to eat it. Everything in your life. Somebody gives you a tremendous compliment, so the challenge is not to think, wow, I did that. It's rather to think, Baruch Hashem, Hashem gave me that particular ability or talent, whatever it was. Everything, a person is in a situation of challenge the whole time. And therefore, what I'm getting to here is that seeing as we are in this constant sense of the state of challenge, so a person is tested, and the nature of a person is that he is in a situation where he can be tested, meaning the man has a weakness. He has a weakness to desires, a weakness to things which are, the Torah describes as evil, the desire to glorify himself, the desire to take pleasure in other person's downfall. A person, therefore, should, as much as he can, distance himself from the nature of physicality, which wrapped up in it is the tendency towards sin. We'll see in a second. Because there is no, he says, ki, hine ein lecha tanug olami asher lo yimshoch acharov eze chet ba'akevoy. There is no worldly pleasure which doesn't follow in its footsteps some form of sin. Derech Moshel, he gives a few examples. We know that if food and drink, if it's kosher, it's not Yom Kippur, it's not Pesach, and it's Chometz, but almost everything within the dietary restrictions of a Jew is mutter. But when a person fills himself up and he eats it to satiety, he stuffs himself, so to speak, or even not even stuffs, he just makes himself very comfortable. It makes it more difficult. Everybody knows after having a good, healthy meal, it's much more difficult to go and daven mincha, for example. We know drinking wine is mutter, but drinking wine can lead to aveira. It can lead to prikas ol, throwing off the yoke of heaven by getting involved in licentiousness, immorality. Drinking loosens a person's inhibitions. Wine itself is mutter, but the potential there in wine and food in different ways is to lead a person to a sin. Inside it itself, in the thing itself. Again, a person who gets used to eating, very nicely and spoils himself or is spoiled, is going to find it very difficult to make do with lesser fare, and he'll push himself into a situation where he's prepared to drive himself hard and in order to make money, to keep his possessions and his property. He puts himself in a situation so that his table should be spread according to the way it should be, and he therefore puts himself into the danger of theft to maintain the standard that he's accustomed himself to. This can take a person away from Avodas Hashem, from Torah, and from Tefillah. Now, all of that would not have happened had in the beginning he had not himself allowed to be pulled to those pleasures. So Chazal teach us that the Torah is yored, the Torah al sov daito, of a person. The person understands very clearly what motivates a person. And therefore it says very clearly when it comes to, for example, the one who sees a sota. Now a sota is someone who is suspected of immorality by her husband and is warned not to seclude herself with this person. And she does. She secludes herself with him after she's been warned. And there's a process by which she's brought up to Yerushalayim, and she drinks a certain water, the water mei sota. And this, if she's guilty of immorality, of being with this man, she dies a very unpleasant death. So Chazal teaches one who sees a sota, mi roa sota bekilkula, somebody who sees a sota in her destruction, yazi atzmo min hayam, he should forbid himself from wine, from taking wine. Because he says to himself, he should say to himself, look, where did this all start out? It started out with wine. Wine is mutter, brei pri hagofen. But within wine is that potential. So he has to forbid wine on himself. He becomes a nausea. He forbids upon himself all kinds of great products. Just interesting enough, while we're talking about it, the question is obvious and is asked, why is it that somebody who sees a sota should osir himself from drinking wine? Granted that wine led to this terrible situation, but isn't it enough that to see the terrible punishment that a sota receives, isn't that enough to be a sufficient deterrent that a person is going to be very careful not to get himself into that situation? He sees, isn't the punishment in itself a warning? And there's an interesting psychological idea here, which is that when a person sees somebody punished, what impacts upon him is not so much the fact that this person is being punished, but the aveira is possible. which is why a lot of newspapers, even though they purport to be moralistic and call out people for their immorality, the way they sell the papers or they sell their news value or whatever it is they get, their hits on YouTube or whatever, is by basically selling a kind of prurient interest in the Aveira. People want to read about people doing Aveiras, and if they get punished, it's not the punishment that really impacts them, it's the fact that it's possible. A person sits on, watches the nightly news, the 10 o'clock news, and he sees that these bank robbers got caught for stealing $2 million from the bank. So one would think that, the fact that they sees these guys being shunted off to prison is enough to put him off the idea of stealing. But the reverse is true. When a person looks at that news report on television, he sees that, he thinks to himself, wow, people do this kind of stuff. It's possible to do it. And the same thing is true with sexual immorality. A person's not impacted by whatever it is, the negative fallout of what that is. A person hears, looks, sees something in this area, and they think to themselves, stupid people, why they got caught. If I would do it, I'd be smarter. And therefore, it's not enough that a person sees the punishment of the sota, because the punishment of the sota just teaches him what impacts upon him is not the punishment, but the fact that the Aveira is possible. And therefore, the Torah says that a person has to cut down to the root cause and go and forbid himself from drinking wine. Another idea, he says here, for example, the permissible person it's mutter for him to be with his wife. More than mutter. It's on Shabbos, it's a mitzvah. And yet, Chazal said that there's a thing called Tevilas Ezra. When a man has relations with his wife, he should go to the mikveh. Because why? The whole point of this afterwards is because the Talmid Chachamim should not be around their wives involved in this, as the Lashon of Chazal is, Shelo yiyu Talmid Chachamim mutzuyim eitzel nashehem ketarnegolim, like roosters. Because even though the act itself is mutter, however, there's already, it implants in a person a lust for that which is forbidden. As Chazal say, Evan Katan Yesh Ba'adam, there is a small organ in a man, which when it is satiated, when you feed it, when you satisfy it, it becomes hungry. And when it's made to hunger, if you starve it, it's satisfied. And that's other ideas here, which we won't go into now, but the idea, again, is the same idea, that a person should limit his involvement with the physical world, because the physical world has inbuilt into it the possibility to lead to sin. Again, another example, clothing, adornment. Everything is mutter for a person to wear, provided that it's not a mitzvah of shatnez, of woolen linen, some kind of forbidden. And yet, the fact that when a person gets himself too involved, and this is true both of men and women, I think, in dressing up in all his finery and making sure he has all the best suits and the best clothes, and he stands in front of the mirror and preens himself. So this is something which brings to immorality, and apart from the fact that it gives rise to envy of other people. Chazal tell us in Bereshis Rabbah, Kiven shero hayetza odom shetole ba'ad akevoy. The Yetzer Hara sees somebody who, I don't know how you translate this, is like hanging on his heels, I guess kind of like posing. And Mamamesh Godov, and he's like, he's straightening out his clothes the whole time. I'm not saying that he's, when he gets, just make sure that he's neat. I'm saying somebody who's constantly adjusting himself and preening, I think the word is. Umasal sel basaro, and he's twisting his curls. Oimer, the Yetzer Hara says, Zeh sheli, that one's mine. He's mine, I've got him. Again, hatil va'adibor im eina b'davar isur. Til, going for holidays, going for trips, and speech in itself is something which isn't asa. Me'ika adin, for sure it's mutter. However, til, trips, takes a person away from Torah, causes bittul zman. And how many lies, how much slander, and how much kalus ros, how much frivolity comes about through people talking. As it says in Mishlei, Barov devarim lo yechtal posha. In many words, there's no ceasing of sin. I remember a story just reminded me of my Rebbe, who there was a bocher who was in his yeshiva, and he was having a bit of a tough time. He found it very difficult to learn. So he said, Rebbe, I've got to go up to the north. I need to go to the Kavarim and I need to daven. And in the middle of the Zman, this was. So Rebbe said, no, you don't have to learn. You come and sit in the back of the base of Medrash. I don't care what you do, but you sit in the base Medrash. Why? Because very important that a person maintains a certain, what's called in Hebrew, tzura, a form, a pattern, a shape. Somebody a Shiva Bacha who goes up to the north on a til, everybody says, I need to chill. Again, maybe nowadays it's changed. We're in a much weaker generation. And I see that many yeshivas, this one included, organizes many tours to the Bachrim. I'm not criticizing that. But let's say somebody who just wants to take off. So there's always the danger that leads to a bittul zman, a lack of Torah learning. But more than that, and my Rebbe's point was as follows: when a person's sitting in the base medrash, he's protected the tzura, the form of him being a yeshiva bacha. He may not be learning, but he's in the base medrash. As soon as he goes out, he's not a yeshiva bacha anymore. He's lost the tzura. The tzura of things is so important. I'm reminded of a story of the Chofetz Chaim, who somebody once asked him, I'm sure we all share the problems of davening. Davening is a very difficult thing to do on a constant basis. Many times, much of the time, our minds wander. So somebody once said to him, Rebbe, why should I bother davening when I don't feel like it? When the inspiration hits, then that's the time you can pray. But you can't pray. How can you pray if you don't feel like it, if there's no emotion there? So the Chofetz Chaim gave him a mashal, a parable of a watch repairer. Now, back in the day in Europe, of course, there were no repair shops to take your watches to. So there would be a watch repairer, who would literally make his tour around all the shtetl, all the small Jewish towns. And he'd probably come once a year or something like that to come and repair all the watches and the clocks in the village. And so everybody would store up their watches and clocks waiting for the clock repairer to come. And he'd come and everybody would stand there on the line and he'd take one clock after another and he goes, yep, I can fix that. I can fix that. No, I can't fix that. No. Yes, I can fix that. And so somebody said, what's the difference? He said, well, you see, these clocks over here, they're broken. But the owners used to wind them up once in a while. They used to keep them wound up. So the mechanism stayed intact, even though it was broken. Over here, the owners of these clocks, they just left them, and now they're rusted solid. There's nothing I can do with them. The analogy is an analogy to prayer. Much of the time when a person davens, it doesn't connect. But the mechanism is kept working, so at the time where inspiration does fill you, the mechanism of prayer will be there. It's one idea. So the idea over here is similarly that even though a person may feel like he needs a break, he needs to chill, and again, this is not across the board. Everybody has their own Rebbe, everybody has their own particular situation. But a lot of the time, it may be better to maintain the tzura, the form, and just to keep going, even on a very, 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 very limited level of inspiration. Because when the inspiration returns, which it does, Everybody, from the Gadol Hador to the smallest Jew in existence, is on a wheel. Big wheels and small wheels. Days of enlightenment, days of darkness. They called Yemei Sina, Yemei Ava, Kabbalistic ideas that a person just goes through these cycles. I mean, Chazal understood this long before psychologists. We all know that feeling. We know some days we leap out of bed and we just can't wait to get down and daven and get to the base medrash, and other days it's very difficult. You don't want to look at your chavrusa and you don't open the siddur. But as we all know, things change. We're all going on these cycles. So inevitably the cycle will be there. So that's the idea, that a person, by preserving the shell, even though the shell may feel very empty and very cold and very without taste, but it's there, ready to work when the inspiration will and does return. So, excuse me, klal hadava. The general principle here is, as we said, the world, everything in the world, physical things in the world, have great dangers. And therefore somebody who desires to escape and to increase his distance from those dangers in the world, this is what's called sensible precious. This is precious hatov, good separation. And this is the important idea here, is that, and I'll read this as he says it in Hebrew, Shelo yikach min ha'olam b'shum shimush shehu mishtamesh mimenu ela ma shehu muchrach bo mipnei hatzorich asher lo v'tiva olav. Key line here. The idea of precious is that a person should take absolutely nothing except those things, anything from the world, of all the things that one can use in the world, except those things which are absolutely necessary for him, what he needs, because of his nature. And of course, it's very easy. How do you know what you need? Most of us manage to conflate our needs with our wants. It becomes very difficult sometimes to separate between a need and a want. And usually when a person's left to himself, it's almost impossible. Most of what we claim our needs are usually wants. And I think that's where it becomes very important, to have a Rebbe. Say lecha Rav. You have a Rav, knei lecha chaver, you have friends. So they don't have your Yetzer Hara, right? So a person can look at you objectively and say, you go to your Rebbe and you say, Rebbe, I need to do exercise. So how much exercise do you need to do? Maybe you love doing exercise, so maybe, half an hour a day, an hour a day is enough. You don't need to do 3 hours. So sure that a person needs a certain amount of sleep, he needs a certain amount of olam hazeh. We're human beings. And, the word physicality, chumrius, is connected to the word chamor, which is a donkey. If a person doesn't feed his donkey, it's going to collapse and die. It's impossible, and that's what we're saying over here, that a person shouldn't be too strict with himself. On the other hand, he has to know what are his needs as opposed to his wants. And for that, it's very difficult without the help of an outside objective arbiter to be, which you need someone to guide you and say, this you need and this you don't need. In point of fact, it's interesting because everything that you do for your own recreation, let's take the example of sport. Let's say a person loves to go running and he needs to run half an hour a day. So that half an hour running is a half an hour of mitzvah. Minute 31 becomes an aveira if he doesn't need it. Or at least if it's not exactly an aveira, it could be that it's now lacking in precious. Again, it has to be understood. But a person understands that doing what he needs to do is a mitzvah. It says, "V'nishmartem es nafshosechem ma'oid." The only time the Torah says very much, you should guard your health. Very, very much. A person can be machmir when it comes to looking after himself, and should be machmir, staying well away from anything. But of course, there are limits to that. It doesn't mean that a person has to spend 4 hours a day in the gym pumping up his muscles. So, whenever a person does something which is for his needs, so that becomes a mitzvah. He's making himself a proper, fit, healthy vessel to serve Hashem. And also it's important that another idea, which is an interesting idea, which is, let's say that a person goes and he exercises, and let's say 20% of his kavanah, his intention, his mindset is because he wants to be a healthier person to serve Hashem. And let's say 80% is because he loves doing it. Now, we have a principle which is called batul barov, which literally means nullified by the majority. For example, let's say somebody poured, let's say a better example. Let's say you have 3 pieces of meat in front of you, and you know 2 of them are kosher, and 1 of them is not kosher. Me'ika hadin, on the Torah level, you could actually eat all 3 of them. Chazal say, take 1 of them and throw it away, and only eat 2. The point is that when you have the majority of something, the usual principle is that the majority overwhelms the minority. And in some senses, it could actually be that it doesn't exist at all. So you might have thought that if a person has 20% kavanah when he's running around the block, I want to do this to make me a healthy Jew so I can daven and learn better, and 80%, wow, this is great, I love this. You might have thought, well, that 80% overweighs and knocks out the 20%. The answer is no, it doesn't. Even though usually we say that the rove nullifies the miut, the minority, in that particular case is not true. You have your 20% of l'shem shemayim, for the sake of heaven, even though that's by far and away not your major intention. So, I mean, I'm saying this actually, it's kedai, it's worthwhile whenever you do anything that's physically pleasurable, that a person should have in mind that he's doing this because he wants to serve Hashem and to thank Hashem. I mean, why do we say brachas? We say brachas to recognize on fruit, on food, is to understand where it's coming from, to thank Hashem for it. Many people, when they sit down to Shabbos, before they eat anything, they say the covered Shabbos Kodesh, for the honor of Shabbos. The more physical something is, the more a person has to make his own efforts to. Anyway, there are, I think we're going to leave it here. So that is, we'll stop here with that there are 2 kinds. We haven't got to the second type, the foolish kind of separation. We'll speak about that next week. But the good type of separation is that a person should, wherever he's involved in something physical, be it what it may, he should understand that the physicality itself has this tendency, a strong pull, to pull him over the line. Even though, as we said, taking just one example, wine. Wine is perfectly permissible. But within wine itself, there is a possibility to end up in all places, kinds of places you don't want to end up in. Licentiousness, immorality, drunkenness. It goes without saying. Now, the questions we want to talk about next week is, first of all, we want to understand and identify. So then what is the unhealthy kind of separation? Precious, which is not good. And the other thing we'll discuss next week is that if this is such a good thing, that a person, the physical world contains within it this inevitable draw towards over the boundary, to take a person into the area, God forbid, of sin. So why is it then that Chazal didn't make all of these things also? Why is this in the level of, as we said last week, in the level of precious? Precious is a level which not everybody is expected to do. The first half of this book is about tzidkus, about righteousness. What's righteousness? The definition of righteousness is what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, the halacha. We're now in the rarefied atmosphere of that which is beyond the norms. But if that's true, if it's such a good thing to do these things, so why didn't Chazal make that a necessity as opposed to something which is considered to be, so to speak, beyond the letter of the law. Lifnim Ashuras Adin. And Bezrat Hashem, we'll finish off this chapter next week. Okay, thank you.